Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Beat the Big Guys. I'm so thrilled to be here every single week. I, the host, Sandy Rosenthal, along with my producer, Landry Bone, we bring to you tools, tips, and tricks to help you beat the big guys in your own neighborhoods. And we do that every week by interviewing a guest. And this week, my guest is from the great city of New Orleans, where I'm also from, and his name is Rob Lalka. Hey, Rob.
Hey, Sandy, thank you so much for having me.
You're so welcome. It turns up this event is happening because your publisher, unbeknownst to you, sent me a copy of your book.
Well, I'm so glad you got it. That's one of the first copies to exist right there in your hands.
There's a special name for this. It's a pre-publication book. It's called a reader.
Reader copy and advanced galley copy, I've also heard.
Yeah, advanced copy. So I've got something really special right here. And I was thrilled to get it because I realized, oh, I know Rob Locker, and here we are today. So
So,
it's interesting how the world works sometimes. But we have a lot of cool stuff to talk about besides that. And so if it's okay, Rob, I'd like to go ahead and introduce you and turn the mic over to you, okay?
beautiful.
Rob Lalka is the Albert R. LePage Professor in Business at Tulane University's A.B. Freeman School of Business. He is the author of Venture Alchemist: How Big Tech Turned Profits into Power from Columbia University Press. Kirkus Reviews called it an impressive work of research and intellectual reflection, adding this praise. The body of work addressing this subject now seems inexhaustible, but this book must count as among its most clear-eyed, well-researched, and morally uncompromising examples. That's fantastic, and that's a fantastic review. And I'm reading it myself, and I look forward to talking about some of the really cool things that I've seen in it. But more importantly, we want to hear from you. So take it away, all yours.
Thanks so much, Sandy, and thanks again for having me. Um, for your audience and thinking about how do you challenge people in power and how do you maintain that sense of right and wrong when so much in the world seems like it's going the wrong way. Um, I wanted to really focus on one story that I think is really salient, really timely for us, which especially, I mean, at Tulane University just yesterday, there were some pretty angry protests. Like I think that's a nice way of putting it. And at Columbia University, right now, as I'm speaking, the administrative building at Columbia has been taken over. And one of the things that's interesting that people talk about is that this has happened before. This happened in the late '60s. Um, but the story that I tell in my book from actually 1977, I think is the most interesting one because this is at Stanford University, and there were sit-ins where over 1,000 students had been protesting apartheid in South Africa. And the sit-in had led to 294 arrests. And so the next day, 900 students showed up again the next day. And what they were chanting was apartheid means profit. Stanford won't stop it. And the students were protesting the fact that Stanford had both received securities from South African companies that were based in South Africa and that were doing business there, that were worth about $18.9 million at the time. And they had a range of investments in South African companies, mining operations, other assets. And the students actually ran the numbers. Like these were very smart kids who were trying to figure out what would it take to divest from apartheid, from South African apartheid. And it would have cost Stanford $125 million in the endowment in those days, which is it'd be about 4 or 5 times more these days. This is a lot of money. This is a big decision that Stanford would have needed to make in order to divest, again, from 1977. So what's interesting for me is that you're hearing some of these same mantras today, some of these same declarations about the need for universities to divest. And you're hearing some of the same arguments on the opposite side of saying, well, actually, you have more of a seat at the table if you stay invested, and you can actually push back as a shareholder rather than pulling your money out. And so there's an interesting debate around that, especially when you think about a city like ours in New Orleans, where climate change is very real, and it's very much something that we contend with every time there's a major storm, especially if it's a hurricane, in hurricane season. But also, we're in a state that is oil and gas and a lot of energy companies. And so there's a big debate here in New Orleans around not just what we're seeing with Israel and the Palestinian territories, but also what we're seeing through many different issues in business. The question and the debate around environment, social, and governance issues. Can you hold companies to account for issues around equity and pay, for instance? There are a number of topics that this becomes really important. Is it better to have a seat at the table as a shareholder, or is it better to sort of let your money do the talking and pull those resources out of certain funds based upon your values? And how do you make those choices? And I'll just sort of finish this opening part by pointing out something I found just so fascinating. So this, for readers who buy the book, this is on page 137, the chapter that's titled "Words Do Matter." Because here's what these students decided to do. They created an alternative endowment in May of 1986. And they said if Stanford would divest from South African companies, the university would then get the money that they'd set aside. If Stanford didn't divest within a decade, then that money would go to Black South African students who could pursue their education wherever they wished. And so these Stanford students were saying, okay, university, you're not going to get my alumni donations unless you do what I say. It's a really interesting, I would even say enterprising move that these students are doing. They're trying to use the power of the almighty dollar to sort of live out their values. What ended up happening was that, of course, Nelson Mandela became president of a multiracial and democratically elected government. And they ended up putting the money in it was called the Amy Beale Fund at Stanford, which was named in honor of a young woman who was a Fulbright scholar who was murdered while she was doing research and volunteer work with predominantly Black communities in South Africa. What's amazing about this, if you dig into the endnotes, though, and that's one of the real beautiful parts about my book, is it's deeply researched. There are 1,902 citations, so you can dig in as deep as you want to go on any of these topics. The people who were behind that alternative endowment included 3 Rhodes Scholars, 2 of whom were some of the top officials in the Obama administration. And now Susan Rice is, of course, in the Biden administration as domestic policy, running the Domestic Policy Council. And Mike McFaul is one of the leading voices, of course, on U.S.-Russian relations and was President Obama's ambassador to Russia. And so these are some of the leaders in terms of policymaking in the last couple of decades. There were Stanford students that were doing this work literally as college kids do. And the other interesting thing is the people who then pushed back on them a few years later, who actually criticized a Stanford church group for protesting apartheid. This was a group of other students who came a few years after McFaul and Rice. Those people included Peter Thiel and David Sachs, 2 of the most successful and wealthiest venture capitalists of all time. And so what is happening on these college campuses today, whether it's here at Tulane, up at Columbia, or really any of these universities, is really important because universities often determine not only what ideas are spreading and what ideas gain salience in a culture and in a society and in business and in the world, but also the very people who were there in this era could be the next Peter Thiel, David Sachs, Mike McFaul, Susan Rice. And I think when we think about how do we approach our young people today and how do these administrations respond to them, it's very important to remember that it's not just about what's happening in this moment. It's about their education. It's about their growth. It's about who do they get to become in the world and how do they respond to the injustices that they see. And I think that's the most valuable part for me as a professor, is knowing that these are all teachable moments and that the students are watching. And if administrators respond in ways where they're exerting power or authority in ways that maybe they don't necessarily like, that will lead to possibly further conflict. And a world in which I think the conflict that we experience every single day seems to be accelerating and worsening. My hope is that university administrators will be able to pause and able to see their purpose in this moment as leaders, Um, whatever form and whatever outcome that may actually lead to, I'm not here to say, but I do think it's important to realize that at least if you think about these stories, the ways that power is wielded and the ways that power is gained is really important in terms of the longer term outcomes over many decades. So with that, I'm looking forward to having a great discussion with you about community organizations, community organizers, community leaders, but also just everyday citizens in our democracy about how you make sure that you are having your voice in a way that's really meaningful.
Bravo. The protest at Tulane, I could hear them last night. To give you an
Wow.
idea how loud they probably were, I'm at the 5,000 block of St. Charles Avenue, and what block is Tulane? 7,000?
That's a long ways. Yeah, you get to
20
hear them.
blocks,
Wow.
20 city blocks. And I
Mhm.
heard them last night. Of course, I
Yeah.
was wondering, what is that? I didn't know until I found out this morning what it was.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I my first thought when I saw the Columbia break-in, and they broke into the building, Hamilton Hall, and they renamed it Hines, Hines, which it was a Palestinian child who was 6 years old who was killed in the conflicts recently. They renamed the building Hines.
Mm.
Um, again, there are no easy answers, and I think that's one of the things that's really important to understand here is there are no easy answers. But with that break-in, one of the things I was discussing with just my students this morning is, you see everyone holding their phones up. They want to be a part of something. They're trying to broadcast this. That's a powerful sort of thing to try and understand. Is that technology that's encouraging that? Is everyone trying to be the hero of their own story, or is it they're trying to document it? What's actually happening with that? I think there are a lot
Or
of
both.
questions. It's all of it.
It's all.
And you think about January 6th, you think about what happened with the break-in then, and similarly, the way that people used technology to organize and also technology to document and to broadcast. And those are some of the questions I raise in my book. Actually, in the book, in chapters 14 into 15, with the story about social media and January 6th and how fast that movement grew, and the decisions that some of these companies made to silence some voices. It's just really interesting sort of trends of our time that we have to grapple with in order to understand what it means to be citizens in a democracy these days.
And it's changing so fast. If I could talk for just a moment about a passage in your book that I thought was so interesting and certainly relevant to me, but relevant to us all as well, and that is when Mark Zuckerberg was using words like kind of, slightly, I think, maybe. And you wrote, these are the words of people grasping to understand something that was so new they didn't quite know how to feel. In 2003, they didn't realize that the internet would become so powerful that our digital lives would overtake our actual lives. Now, 2003 was not that long ago. It's just incredible how quickly things are changing. I truly related to that statement because a mere 2 years later, when all the levees broke in New Orleans, I noticed that anonymous commenters, anonymous people were attacking me online, all using the same words, but they were different people. I knew, Rob, I knew in my bones it was orchestrated. I knew it,
Mm,
but
mm.
I'd never heard of such a thing. I didn't even have the words to describe what was happening.
Wow.
So now we now know, and it was an orchestrated campaign. People in a position of trust, disguising their identity, pretending they're just bystanders, onlookers, and using the brand new web, which no one really understood yet, still trying to understand, using that to attack people, to go after them. So I and not only did I I feel it in my bones, but not only did I not know the word to describe it, I felt like if I did describe it, I sounded like a paranoid. Okay, I sounded
So
paranoid. So it was a really tough
exactly right.
situation. You go
Power
you
is working differently there, is what's happening. And that's what's so interesting, is that power is working differently in a web world, to use Anne Marie Slaughter's beautiful phrasing of it. So Anne-Marie talks about it in the book called The Chessboard and the Web. And she
Mm-hmm.
talks about a web world where power is networked versus a chessboard world where power is just much more determined by clear rules and order and logic. Hierarchies in business and a hierarchical organizational structure is a great example of the chessboard world. A web world is much more the way you're talking about how information is spread, and being a strong node in that network is actually going to be much more powerful. There's another book that is called New Power that also talks about this. It's so interesting because they call power as current rather than currency. And so current flows, whereas currency can be hoarded. In a networked world, it's much more positive sum to look at it in a positive sense versus zero sum, that you can actually gain more power by spreading information and by sharing, as opposed to hoarding resources. It's the same with data in a networked world, that you're able to gain more value from the data the more that it has exposure to other parts of that network, of that web. But it can also be dangerous because, of course, terrorist networks are a part of what happens there. Of course, I talk in the book about how after 9/11, it wasn't that these extremists became rocket scientists. They turned airplanes into bombs, is what happened on 9/11. They turned airplanes into bombs. And they used what's usually employed on a daily basis for travel for family or for business into a weapon of mass destruction. And I think that that's something that we're still grappling with in this day and age of how does a networked world, how does a world in which you can gain power through networked purposes and almost start at the edges and be an outlier, it becomes an organizer. And then those outliers become organizers, and then you see where that can eventually go. That does eventually lead to, like I mentioned earlier, January 6th. You see where extreme ideas can actually become much more mainstreamed because of the internet. And so these are very powerful trends, and they're really important tools to understand. And I think that's something
Mm-hmm.
for your listeners, is they're trying to figure out how do they mobilize, hopefully for the right things, hopefully for things that will make a real difference in their communities. Um, these tools can be very powerful, but they can also be very dangerous. And I think knowing how to wield the tools. One of the other points I do make is that the
Mm-hmm.
tools are amoral. It's not that the tools are evil. It's the tools are amoral. They can be used for good or evil, but tools are designed for a purpose. Unfortunately, much of social media, the algorithms work in ways in which extreme content on both the left and the right, on both sides of a topic, the extreme content is the stuff that will get people's attention. And so that's what's maximized by the algorithms. And so as a result, that tool has been designed for a particular purpose. And those tools then need to be wielded by people who hopefully are acting in better faith, who are acting to shed more light than heat, is what I talk about in the book. How do you ensure that people are actually shedding light, trying to do the right thing, trying to encourage honest, truthful conversations, truth seeking, and not trying to destroy or trying to deny?
Well, I was actually accused of being a fake when I first tried to get out sounding the alarm and trying to get the truth out. I was accused of being a fake in the
Wow.
early days. And I didn't understand why people was saying that. Well, now many years down the road, I now know, and I sound like a bit of a cynic, but a lot of these quote unquote grassroots groups that look like they sprung up from nothing were actually orchestrated and created by businesses to do their bidding. And
And
they're not illegal. They're
no,
not
that's right.
illegal.
And
But
I think that's what's powerful is that when you think about the way that that can actually be wielded in a world in which business does exert so much authority and control, and especially in a world in which because of Citizens United, businesses are able to put unlimited amounts of money into both ballot initiatives, but also
mhm,
political candidates. The examples I use in the book is how Uber does this along with other sharing economy companies for Prop 22. So they basically change people's opinions using not only the Uber app, but also over $200 million in California. They change people's opinions about how to vote on Prop 22. You also see it, for instance, with J.D. Vance in his campaign. He was fifth in a field of five in the Republican primary in Ohio when he was running for U.S. Senate. And Peter Thiel put more money behind a super PAC that backed him than anyone has ever had, and he became U.S. Senator from Ohio.
Mm.
In part because he was previously saying he was never Trump. He said, that Trump was a demagogue. He even compared him to Hitler. And then the next thing you know, he's saying things like Trump is the best president of his lifetime, and being able to change his. If we're talking about truth seeking, changing the things that he held to be true into other things that were being represented there. I think it's a really interesting story to look at and analyze, and frankly to understand how that could create greater risks in the future, because there has to be some sense of what you say matters, that words matter, and I think that that's important when we try and consider the power and the money that's being wielded by these large tech companies.
Exactly. Well, I do have a word of encouragement following in response to your very good point that organizations have lots of money that they can spend, conglomerates, Fortune 500 companies that they can spend creating these fake groups, which I just already pointed out are not illegal. But if you're caught, the damage that does to the goodwill of a company is sometimes unfixable. What do you call it? It lasts forever. It can't get rid of it. There was a big famous one right here in New Orleans. Entergy was caught. It's to this day, it was almost 10 years ago, but it's still called the fake actor scandal, the paid actor scandal, where Entergy paid people to fill City Hall, but they
That's
were
right.
caught. Mm-hmm.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And they were
But even
caught,
in
and
that
the
case,
CEO had stepped down, had to resign immediately over that.
that's exactly right. Entergy, certainly there was a comeuppance with them. There was a sense that that definitely damaged their reputation. But for some of these companies, even when they get caught, as long as they win that ballot initiative or what have you, they're getting the results that they want. And so, you look at Uber with Prop 22, over $200 million that was spent. Sandy, they were literally paying the head of the California NAACP to back the effort to say that not paying drivers as employees would advance racial equity. And they were caught doing that. They paid her over $80,000. Um, and and still the ballot initiative passed, and they were able to move forward. So what's interesting about that is some of these are old dirty tricks, paying people off, or having one of the other fascinating things that Uber did was in Democratic districts, liberal and progressive districts in California, they ran fake ballots that would have, this is what the Democratic Party of California supports. And then they would have the last thing on the list be something that was pro Prop 22, even though the Democratic Party was not pro Prop 22. It was basically a way for them to sort of shift those votes and hopefully to be able to move towards the Democratic candidates, but also then the Prop 22 issue as if it were being supported by the Democratic Party. There were shell groups that were set up to be able to sort of push all of that out that I fully document in my book. And that, again, for any reader who wants to go deeper, it's all there in the endnotes. I cite it all really thoroughly so that anyone who wants to really understand this stuff, again, my hope is to shed more light and so that people can then look and see.
You mentioned earlier that you asked a question. I don't know if you're being rhetorical or if you, but what you asked was, can you hold companies to account for their behavior? And I believe you can. I believe that you can with the power of your purse. Purse, if you are selling something, if people just stop buying it. So that's one way to hold companies to account. And then the other way to hold them to account is by, as I mentioned just a minute ago, uncover something that harms their goodwill, which does have a money value. It may not bring the company down, but it certainly affects their shareholder value. What was it? Ace Harry's Hardware, a national company, was caught doing hanky panky, making up a fake blogger. This is back when blogging was a thing, and they were caught, and that harmed their business. And anything that because large organizations, I'm just going to say this and back to you because this is about you, is large companies guard their goodwill, with more energy than they guard their own kids. If anything to hurt that goodwill, hurt the bottom line, shareholders, et cetera. And so, so long as you've got that, I believe, yes, that you can hold company to account for their bad behavior. But I want to know, were you being rhetorical or do you believe they can, Rob?
So, Sandy, do you mind if I read one paragraph from near
No,
the end of the? Is that
no,
all right?
no.
So let me read one paragraph. I'm going to give away just a little bit of the ending of where I land on all of this because I think it's, especially for your audience, I think it's something that they'll really enjoy hearing. So this is in the epilogue. It's page 322. And don't worry, folks, the book's only 324 pages. And so it's right near the end, and there's not much more after this. But this is where I end the book, as I say, um, the better rebellions arise every day in our democracy in uncelebrated but profound acts of self-sacrifice. They will also appear with the flip of a switch and the simple but sacred act of voting. In that light, the least wealthy and allegedly least worthy will know that they deserve liberty and justice just the same as anybody else in a democracy, and they will vote. They will vote with their dollars and what they choose to buy. They will vote with how they spend their time and attention. They will vote with the businesses they support and the ones they even start themselves. They will gradually regain their footing, then vote with their feet, turning beliefs into movements and faith into action. And they will vote with their votes.
Page 322.
You got it.
And he's right. After that is footnotes. So
A whole bunch of pages of footnotes. That's
a
it.
thousand footnotes. Wow. Wow, that's impressive. Uh, uh, this is a great book. It is a textbook. I think there's no doubt about it. Right? Am I right, Rob? It's a textbook,
Yeah,
but it
so I
does.
went with Columbia, yeah, I went with Columbia University's business press because it's one of the most well-respected, one of the oldest university presses in the entire country. I
Okay.
wanted to work with top people, and so this book was fully peer-reviewed, fully editorial reviewed by the best scholars in business. And yet, I'm hoping it's not just a business book. I'm hoping
It's
that average folks just
yeah.
enjoy it.
It's
Really good
readable,
stories.
very readable. I mean,
I
he
appreciate it.
grabs you at the beginning and they don't want to put it down. So
Oh,
it's
thank you.
very highly readable. I think probably the best thing of all is to have a textbook that every university is going to buy and have it that the general public going to like. I think that's a perfect balance. So I think you've done it, Rob.
Well, I really appreciate it, Sadie. My grandmother was a consummate storyteller. I actually began in the acknowledgments, as you saw, with stories about my family, and she was really one of the inspirations for this because she had this amazing way of telling stories that just stuck with you.
Mhm.
I'm hoping I did something like that with this, is that
You,
these stories will stick with people and help them to understand the way the world is.
I think you did. And I wondered, we still have a little time. Can we talk some about how words do matter? The,
Ooh, I
the
love that phrase. Yeah.
it's so and what I've noticed is that very quickly, in fact, I'd love to talk about this example with you. After the Sandy Hook deadly, horrible disaster with the kindergarten children, it was called the Sandy Hook disaster, the
Mhm.
name of the school. Okay,
Mhm.
even though it's in a city of the city has a name. I can't
Mhm.
remember what call, but let's call it Brewster. Okay, but it was the Sandy Hook disaster. Meanwhile, a very similar sort of disaster happened in Texas. The U starts with a U. Oh, help me, Bob. There was
Uvalde, Texas.
yeah. Okay, it was the town of Uvalde, but the school was Robb Elementary. Now, why did all the little white kids, it was Sandy Hook, but why did all the little Hispanic kids, it was the name of the town, which was
Mm.
most people would recognize as not not English, and so why wasn't it Robb Elementary? Words matter, and I believe that was not by accident. That was highly, highly intentional. Who they are, I don't know, but I believe that was intentional, and it happens fast. And once it's created, it is impossible to change. So anyway, what's your comment on that, Rob?
Yeah, so the words do matter. That piece actually comes from something that Condoleezza Rice had said. She talked about how words do matter, and this was in 2016 when she was criticizing then presidential candidate for again 2016 it was Donald Trump who was running for president, and she was saying you got to be careful what words we're using here because words do matter. That's what she said, and I take that very important notion about why words matter so much in the way we talk about others, the way we talk about ourselves, the stories we tell ourselves, the narratives that we embrace and those we reject. Um, Words matter because words are, they carry significance in how you use them and what they mean in a more profound way than almost anything else. And so let's take it to one of the main themes that I bring out in the book is that I really do believe that the way that people talked about woke, originally it was a liberal way of talking about understanding themselves, of people who wanted to be, woke. And then the right picked it up and started using it as a criticism, saying woke is actually a bad thing. It's a really good example because that word then was appropriated and reappropriated, and it's been turned into something that's very you're either not woke enough or you're anti-woke, and it's become something that's used to divide us, and it's become something that's used to signal whether you are liberal or conservative, whether you're on the left or the right. And my point, in trying to analyze that, especially when you think about technology and the way that tech companies are maximizing, as I mentioned earlier, their algorithms to drive extreme content, but also that you only get to see things that you already agree with, that you're seeing things that reinforce your worldview from people. There's a mimesis happening there. You're doing what other people who are like you are doing and seeing other things that they're seeing, and it creates an insularity. I think it's very, very unhealthy for democracy. I think it's very unhealthy for who we are, frankly, as Americans, because my best experiences are ones where I am around people who disagree with me, but we're not disagreeable. We can have an honest conversation about the world we want to live in. It doesn't mean I have to change my mind. It does mean I have to understand that there are others who think differently than I do. And that's valuable when you think about, I mean, for me and my experiences growing up, it's, the people I met through church and through the work that we were doing in the community. It's the work that I do in New Orleans, in my neighborhood. It's the opportunities that I have to, see the world through my son's eyes when we're going to school and going to Boy Scouts, Cub Scouts, all of those things. Those are real experiences that you have to be present for, and you put your phone down and you're not just saying the angriest or the most extreme argument you can make to try and prove how right you are. And so that's something that the book really does spend a lot of time doing, is trying to understand what words are we using right now, including woke and anti-woke, and how are those words being weaponized? And if they're being weaponized, we do have choices to put down those weapons and to say, I'm not going to engage in a way which is going to divide us further, even if it feels right, even if it feels like you're in the right place. I hope that people, after reading my book, will be a bit more humble in how they approach any of these topics. Because, like I said, the big tech, powerful organizations that are making so much money are benefiting from the times that we are so angry. But I don't think that we are benefiting as a country, as a community, and frankly, with our own families. I think that that's something I'm very worried about because I don't want the next generation to have it worse off than we do.
I totally agree with what you just said. We're about out of time. Is there any last words of wisdom you'd like to share with our listeners?
Well, I would just say that even if you're not that interested in entrepreneurship or big tech, that this book is meant to sort of introduce these stories in a fresh way, in a new way that hopefully is very accessible. And so I hope your readers or your listeners will consider becoming readers, and even if it's just checking the book out from your local library. This is a book that hopefully will start conversations and will help people to understand. At the very beginning, I dedicate it to my students and to my sons. And that's a purposeful dedication. I'm hoping this will make a difference the next generation. And I also said I want to shed more light than heat. And I'm hoping that contribution in the world, even though there are things in here that are quite controversial, I'm hoping it'll actually be something that makes a meaningful difference in a way that does shed light.
Thank you so much, Rob. I'm so glad you could join us today.
And thank you for everything that you're doing, Sandy. It's really great sitting with you and sort of talking all this through.
You're welcome. Stay with me. I'm just going to say goodbye to the folks, but I'm going to be right with you, okay? Just hold on.
Okay.
So, thank you, the listeners, for joining me today. I hope you liked this episode. Be sure to like, subscribe, and rate this podcast on all of your favorite platforms. For those of you who like video, you can just visit my channel, Sandy Rosenthal. And everyone, no matter what, remember that no matter who you are, you too can beat the big guys. Okay, Rob, stay with me.
Yeah. Thank you. It was fun.
Yeah, one more second. What is this?